that confused with the palatine process, which is higher up. So we're just talking about this rectangle right here. It's the horizontal plate. And then on either side, we have these little holes, which are called the palatine foramina. Foramina is just a plural version of the word foramen. And on the parietal bone, there's two parietal bones. So this is one of them. They're on either side of your skull. And on both of them, there are these ridges right here. It's pretty faint in this picture, but it's called the temporal lines, and it's where muscles come up from your jaw and attach to those right there. The sphenoid bone is the trickiest for most people because it's got a lot of terms. It's kind of confusing. It's right in the middle of the skull. There's a lot going on here, so I'll try and break it down as best I can. The foramen lacerum, you can't see in either of these pictures actually, but it would usually be right here. So it's where the sphenoid bone comes and attaches to the bone behind it, but there's a hole left right there. So it would usually be right about here, but you can't quite see it. There's a little shadow there. That's where the foramen lacerum would be. The next three here are the ones that get confused a lot. There's the foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and the foramen spinosum. The way I keep these straight is I remember that the oval is in the middle. It looks like an oval shape, so that's the easiest for me to remember. And sometimes I'd get the rotundum and the spinosum confused, so I decided to just say, okay, so from top to bottom, it's always going to be R-O-S. And in this picture, R-O-S. So rotundum, ovale, spinosum. And you can see all three when you're looking from a superior view of the inside of the skull. But if you're looking from underneath, you cannot see the foramen rotundum. So just be careful of that. We have the greater wing next, which is just this section under here. It's kind of that butterfly wing shape on the inside of the skull. And it's a little easier to see here because it's isolated. And then the highlighted in green is the lesser wing. So just this section up here. And then the inferior orbital fissure actually is in the next slide, in the next picture. I think I've covered everything that's in this picture, except for the sella turcica, which is right here. The way I like to remember it, turkey saddle. Looks like a saddle, like when you ride a horse. And then turcica reminds me of turkey, so I always just think turkey saddle, sella turcica. Just this right here. And then right above that, you can't quite see it in this photo. This one's a little more obvious. It's the optic canal. So right above this sella turcica are the optic canals. And then this is a great picture of the outside of the greater wing, the sphenoid bone. So this here's the greater wing. You can see it on the temples and on the inside of the eye sockets. This hole here, these are the superior orbital fissures, and then these down here lower are the inferior orbital fissures. And then the last terms with the sphenoid bones that I want to go over are the medial and lateral pterygoid plates. These can be really confusing if you don't orient yourself on what you're looking at and where you are on the skull. So the easiest way that I find to do this is remember that you're looking from an inferior view. You're going to see the zygomatic arch here. You're going to see the horizontal plate of the palatine process, or of the palatine bone. And then you'll see these occipital condyles down here. So you have the roof of the mouth, the cheekbones, and then the occipital condyles. And in the middle of all that, we have the medial right here, and then the lateral right here, pterygoid plates. And then in between them is the vomer bone. So medial and then lateral. Temporal bone is a weird shape. It's got a lot going on. So it comes from the squamous suture. Down here includes all of these, and then this little section here as well. Excuse me. The carotid canal, you can see from inside the skull. Like if we go back to a picture of the sphenoid bone, usually the foramen lacerum are right here, and then just adjacent to those, coming downward this way, are the carotid canals. Let's see. External acoustic meatus is this hole right here. That's where your ear is. The internal acoustic meatus and the jugular foramen are right next to each other on the inside of the skull. Let's see if we have a picture of those. I don't think so, but they're right next to each other. The jugular foramen are very big and quite obvious, and then if you look just above those, there's little internal acoustic meatus. The mastoid process is this big bump right here. If you reach behind your ear, you can actually feel that bump right there, and then if you hold your thumbs on it and then turn your head, you can feel that there's a muscle that's attached right there. So that's how I remember that it's back right behind that external acoustic meatus, and then it's really big and you can feel it, and it's a really obvious protuberance. So that's the mastoid process. The petrous and the squamous portion, so this is just a way that we divide up the temporal bone into two separate sections when we're looking on the inside of the skull. So you can see that on pictures inside of the skull. The styloid process is right next to the mastoid process. It's a lot smaller and a lot thinner. It's really pointy. And then in between those two is the stylomastoid foramen. So if you haven't taken medical terminology yet, this is where it gets really helpful, because we start to piece together words from other processes or bones or features of bones and turn them into a different name for something else. So we take stylo from styloid process and mastoid from the mastoid process, and we say stylomastoid foramen, which is just a little hole where if you flip the skull over and look from the bottom, you can see a little hole in between these two processes here. The zygomatic process of the temporal bone is this little section here. It's still on the temporal bone, so we say of the temporal bone, but it's right before it meets the zygomatic bone, so it's called the zygomatic process. On the zygomatic bone, we have the infraorbital margin, which is just the bottom of the eye socket here, this ridge. We have the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So this is the temporal process because it's right before the zygomatic bone meets the temporal bone. And then we have the zygomatic arch. I'll talk more about that in a second. I actually have a better picture in the next couple slides. A few other miscellaneous bones that you need to remember is the vomer. We talked about how you can see that in between the medial pterygoid plates. You can also see it right here on the inside of the nose, right behind the anterior nasal spine. The hyoid bone is just a horseshoe shape that hangs beneath the jaw and attaches at the throat. So you won't see it with just the isolated skull, but it's just this little hanging horseshoe. The nasal bone is just the bridge of your nose right here. That one's fairly straightforward. And the lacrimal bone is on the inside of the eye socket right here, this little section of bone right there. And then if you look right here, there's kind of a shadow, but we can't see from this angle exactly, but that's the nasolacrimal canal. There's a little hole right there on both sides. And then I just wanted to add this last slide because I've gotten quite a few questions about this. This is one of the most missed questions on the skull quiz, and it's the difference between the temporal process, the zygomatic process, and the zygomatic arch, which it can be very confusing, so I'll go over it real quick right now. So we name it by saying the process of the bone it's attaching to, and then we say of the blank bone, of the bone that it's on, if that makes sense. So the temporal process is on the zygomatic bone. So temporal process because it's right about to meet the temporal bone right here, but it's still on the zygomatic bone. Same with the zygomatic process. We're about to meet with the zygomatic bone, but we're still on the temporal bone. And then zygomatic arch includes both. So a few tricks with by just looking at these pictures, just so that you don't get mixed up when you see all the different pictures, maybe isolated by themselves, is the zygomatic arch will have both the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone highlighted in light blue. And then this section in dark blue will highlight both of the processes because it goes over this suture here. So the dark blue highlight crosses the suture. So it highlights both. Whereas on these ones, it only highlights one bone in light and then just one side of the process right here. Hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to ask. Happy studying.